This event has been an incredible event today. Really great, many thanks to all of the incredible speakers. Really, for me, it's been an opportunity to take away both information and inspiration. Now, clearly, there are better treatments needed, and what I do every day is try to develop new treatments, and it's an inspiration for me to really continue to do everything possible to try to advance better treatments for narcolepsy. As Monica described, I'm a scientist by training, and I've been involved in drug development and discovery for over 20 years now. I'm based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I've worked in large pharma and in small biotech as well. And basically, the drug development process is fundamentally the same across both big pharma and small biotech. There are certainly different opportunities and different approaches. But my aim today is really to talk more generally about the key components of drug development and the key principles that are involved, to give you kind of a general overview. I'll try to give some examples as I go that are specifically related to narcolepsy and drug development in narcolepsy in my presentation. So first, a disclosure slide. There we go. I work for Orexia Therapeutics. I'm a shareholder of Centessa, who owns Orexia Therapeutics, not receiving any speaker or consultancy fees here, and all the information that is contained in this presentation is available publicly. All right, so if we start here, the first principle of drug development is really establishing a really good understanding of the disorder. And in NT1, this, of course, is going to include knowledge of both sleepiness and cataplexy. The illustration on the right is an attempt to illustrate both partial and complete cataplexy. And these, of course, are key symptoms impacting people with narcolepsy, and they're also the most closely evaluated symptoms in clinical studies of narcolepsy type 1. So basically, when a company is looking to evaluate whether to start drug development in a specific area, there are a couple key things that they're going to look at. They're going to look to see whether or not the molecular mechanisms that cause or contribute to the disease have been identified so that they have a good starting point. They're going to reach out to physicians to try to learn more about the signs and symptoms of the disorder and what are the current treatments. Importantly, and something that's happening much more often now than certainly when I started, in my career, is that companies as well as regulators are listening to individuals who are living with the disorder to better understand the patient experience, if you will, and what are the areas of unmet need in the field so that medicines can be designed that are truly better and meet the needs of the community. Importantly, a company will also look to review treatment guidelines and regulatory guidelines in that specific area to plan a drug development strategy. I think it's important to say that this process here probably could take a couple months. A company would typically spend several months going through and trying to build that understanding. Sometimes a company will take a year to try to decide whether or not this is the right way to go. But once they do, this kicks off then a process that will typically take about 15 years before a drug can be approved, and it'll cost certainly more than $500 million these days, typically, as we work through the discovery and the development phases. So what I'm going to do now is tell you a little bit about those different phases. So it starts then in laboratory research, right? Drug discovery starts in laboratory research. And what you start with is a drug target. And this is a drug target that you believe if you develop a small molecule that interacts with that target, that will have a beneficial effect in the disease. Now, for narcolepsy, one of the newest targets that has been identified is the orexin receptor, and specifically the orexin 2 receptor. And we've heard about that in a number of different presentations already. And the illustration here on the right shows what an orexin 2 receptor might look like. It shows the protein structure and the helices, these transmembrane helices that constitute the three-dimensional structure of that protein. And you have to imagine that this protein is sitting in a cell membrane of a neuron that is in the brain. And we saw a really beautiful video that Dr. Emselem showed, where they were zeroing in to the brain, and you could see the orexin receptor sitting in the cell membrane in the brain. And this is what it would look like at the molecular level. You can also see then that pink blob in the middle, that just represents a specific molecule or candidate drug that might be binding or interacting with that orexin 2 receptor. And in the case of narcolepsy, it would be, we would hope it would be stimulating or activating that receptor. And what's important in this case is that in narcolepsy type 1, the orexin neurons are lost. And so there is no longer sufficient orexin delivered or produced to activate these receptors. And so the aim in drug development here, drug discovery, is to find small molecules that can penetrate the brain and reactivate these receptors that are sitting dormant, basically. So drug discovery research will start with screening hundreds or thousands of new molecules. In fact, these days there are technologies where you can screen 1 billion molecules, perhaps that are attached to DNA, the DNA encoded libraries, for example. Or you can screen 1 billion compounds using virtual screening, computational methods. And from that very large pool, what you're looking for are compounds that will selectively bind to your receptor, but also will have drug-like properties, right? That can easily penetrate the brain and that will have minimal side effects in the body. The drugs are, these compounds then are evaluated in laboratory assays, and these can be bench type assays, but also animal studies. And we heard from Dr. Pever about the genetically engineered mice that are narcolepsy type 1 models. So they experience that these mice are genetically engineered to lack orexin production, and they experience both sleepiness and cataplexy. And those mice allow us to evaluate these compounds for their activity to see whether or not they're actually reducing sleepiness and cataplexy in those mice. There's also some additional assays to look for potential safety issues before we go forward. Once we find a compound, and usually it's more than one that looks to be promising, we move into what's called preclinical research. And this particular phase of research here typically takes between 9 months and 18 months. And what we're doing is we're conducting studies to evaluate both with lab-based or cell-based assays, for instance, what might be shown on the left here, and animal studies to evaluate potential toxicity of the molecule. And these studies help us to define the dose levels that can be evaluated in humans. Now, preclinical studies are pre-IND studies, generally toxicology studies, they're referred to, are conducted to what are called good laboratory practice. These are specific regulations set in all countries that really, they set minimum basic requirements for study conduct, for training of personnel, the quality of facilities, of equipment, pre-specified protocols, and very clearly validated procedures to make sure that we very, very carefully and fully assess in these preclinical models potential for drug toxicity and choose those doses that we then can demonstrate have likelihood to be safe for testing in humans. And we apply using an IND, which is an investigative new drug application to test in humans, and regulators review this data, and then they decide and approve, ideally, the ability for us to move forward and test in clinical studies. So this slide here presents, I know it's a lot of information, but it's various different aspects of clinical development. Importantly, in the narcolepsy space, there is a lot of clinical research that is going on currently. We've heard a lot about some of the clinical studies already today. I'm sure we'll hear more. And if you look on a site like clinicaltrials.gov, which lists available clinical studies, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, there are quite a few studies in this space. And this is really good news for narcolepsy research, for the narcolepsy community. in that, the hope is that some of these studies will result in new treatments. Now, most clinical studies will compare effects of a drug candidate to a placebo. So this is just a very, this is a vehicle, a control, a placebo where there's, no effect. It's the formulation, if you will, without the drug. And that enables you in a blinded fashion. So most clinical studies are conducted where neither the subject in the study nor the investigator or physician running the study, they don't know whether that individual is receiving the drug or the placebo. And this helps to be sure that there is not a bias in terms of how the results are interpreted. Typically, the whole phase of clinical development here takes 5 to 8 years, but it can take more. And there are certainly some exceptions. For instance, vaccine trials, we've all heard about those studies may enroll 10,000 or more patients. Oncology studies may be particularly small, and they usually don't incorporate healthy volunteers, but go straight to patients. But this shows a more typical design of clinical studies where in phase 1, the subjects in that study will be healthy volunteers. And here you look at drug tolerability and safety and see how the treatment affects the body. You may, in some cases, have a few actual patients with the disorder in phase 1, and it's probably up to maybe 100 participants. Phase 2, then, you've already now, you got a good sense of what dose levels might be efficacious and safe and tolerated in humans. And so now you're going to start testing in individuals with the disorder. And your key aim in phase 2, which may take a year, possibly more, is to determine whether the treatment has any benefit at all. And that's called efficacy. You're also going to monitor side effects, and you're going to choose the doses that you want to study in phase 3. And a typical phase 2 study might be somewhere between 100 to 300 participants. In a disorder like narcolepsy, which is a rare disorder, it may tend to be on the smaller side. And for the more common indications, such as obstructive sleep apnea, it might be on the much larger side. But in general, that phase 2 study is trying to choose the doses that you think may be the right doses for treatment and take that into registration studies or phase 3 studies. Phase 3 studies can take 1 to 4 years on average, and there you're really demonstrating efficacy at those doses that you want to be approved for a drug treatment. Definitely going to monitor adverse events, as you do in all phases. And here you're going to have that data that demonstrates a drug treatment for the experimental drug treatment compared to placebo and or a current treatment. You may, in that phase 3 study, design it to just compare to something that is a currently available treatment. That data then will all be submitted to regulators, and there'll be a regulatory review process. A couple of things I wanted to mention in addition to this, across the board, all clinical trials are approved not only by regulators who review the protocol and the data that's available for the drug, but also by an institutional review board, sometimes called an ethics committee. And that contains lay people reviewing those proposals to protect the rights and welfare of the trial participants. Importantly, as I mentioned, there are a number of, narcolepsy is a rare disease. And with that, there's the opportunity to obtain orphan drug designation for a potential or for a candidate in development. And what this does is it provides some additional support and incentives for development of new treatments for rare diseases that may have, quite a few fewer individuals perhaps with that disorder. There are definitions for that. In the US, a rare disease and orphan drug designation is only possible for a rare disease that is affecting less than 200,000 individuals. And in Europe, I believe it is defined as a disorder that is affecting less than 5 in 10,000. And this can help to encourage organizations, encourage companies to invest to develop new treatments for rare diseases. Now, in terms of regulatory review, This is also something that takes some time. It could take perhaps a year after filing all of the data for an NDA to have that review. But the FDA and other regulators do provide accelerated approval pathways in some cases. So one specific, or some of the specific opportunities for that are listed here. You may have heard of drugs that receive, or candidate drugs that are in development, receive a fast track or breakthrough therapy designation. And these are specified by FDA to be given to compounds that are addressing serious conditions with a very high unmet need. And what it provides for the company developing the drug is a very close interaction and guidance from the FDA to make sure that everything is done to expedite development of the particular drug, and for breakthrough therapy designation, which provides that even additional support from senior managers at the FDA. For breakthrough therapy designation, you need actually clinical data demonstrating that you have preliminary signs of efficacy of that drug, and that preliminary efficacy suggests that it's better than the current therapy. And then FDA is going to help you to move that as quickly as possible through development. There are other types of accelerated approval. If the third one down here is if you want to obtain approval based on a surrogate endpoint, or simply priority review, which means that instead of a 12-month process, FDA will commit to review the NDA, the new drug application, within 6 months. And it's not only FDA, as I mentioned, there's also most countries will offer this, and what you'll hear from the EMA is PRIME designation, for instance, in Europe, and that's very similar to breakthrough therapy designation, where there is a requirement for clinical data that is preliminarily showing that the drug candidate has a possibility to be better than approved therapies. So for clinical trials, a lot of people ask, what can I expect from a clinical trial? And importantly, the drug development process overall, one of the most, what you call the work that's on the critical path is trying to identify individuals with a disorder who are interested and appropriate to enroll in studies. So that recruitment, clinical trial recruitment, is something that takes quite a long time, especially for a rare disease such as narcolepsy. And it is incredibly important for learning about a disorder and, of course, developing new treatments to try to make this process as efficient as possible, and also as convenient as possible and as scientifically valid as possible. So a lot of different components come into play here. Clinical trials, of course, are designed to measure safety and efficacy of a potential new drug, and each one of these trials is unique. What is set up for inclusion or exclusion criteria for one trial may be different from another trial, even if it's going after the same type of mechanism, depending on the properties of the drug. And it's very important to work with the study team from the clinical trial, as well as your own physician, to decide if a trial is right for you or not. The box on the right-hand side talks a little bit about the process that one goes through. So if someone is interested in a clinical trial, there's typically a pre-screening process, which is usually a simple questionnaire and an opportunity to ask questions about the trial. If the person appears to meet the inclusion criteria, then you move forward towards an informed consent process where that person has the opportunity to ask many questions and really understand fully what would be involved in that study, and then signs an informed consent form to say, yes, they'd like to participate. The first part of that participation is usually a screening visit, including a physical examination. And in some cases, this may require you to wash out of your current medications or modify in some way what you're taking in order to best evaluate whether that drug then is the new potential drug is safe and efficacious. And importantly, these days, the FDA and regulators across the world are really aiming to increase the diversity of study participants in clinical trials across different ages, races, ethnic groups. These are really important to be sure that we understand how well the compound works across the entire community and not just in certain parts of that community. During the trial, trial participants work with the study team of medical professionals closely. Some participants, as I've mentioned, will receive the study drug and others are given a placebo or some other approved treatment for comparison. There'll be scheduled visits, procedures, laboratory tests, and adverse events or say side effects that occur during the trial are carefully tracked. And of course, as part of that informed consent process, and you can stop participating at any time. Summary of results of these studies will typically be shared and always with some delay because there's going to take some time for the study then to be unblinded, where the company and regulators will look at the results. And then typically these days, a study summary will then be shared with participants and then more generally at a scientific conference. Now, I wanted to just give a sense of the types and the range of clinical studies that are available these days. This was just a look at the end of December. Just went into clinicaltrials.gov and searched for narcolepsy studies. And what you can see here is that out of the, I think there were about 20 studies that were ongoing. 5 of those studies were for potential new medications. But there were a number of other studies as well. So observational studies, I think there were 5 or 6 observational studies that were simply working with individuals with narcolepsy to track what they were taking, what their symptoms were, and try to just learn more by watching and learning what the symptoms, how symptoms were developing, what symptoms were being experienced, and how the current drugs were being used and how effective they were. There are also scientific studies, I think there were 4 of them, looking at different procedures to investigate sleep architecture, to look for different biomarkers that might be used in other clinical studies later to look for efficacy and just understand activation or involvement of different cell types so that we can learn more about what other new targets might be relevant for narcolepsy. There was a study here using a novel wearable technology. Digital technologies are really interesting in terms of wearables, because then you could actually be tracking how a person is responding to a drug, not only when they're in the office or in the lab, in the site, in the clinical site or in the laboratory, but also at home or when they're out doing their typical daily activities. And it would be great to have some of these wearable technologies that could be validated and used in clinical trials. There's also a study in Italy looking at the use of telemedicine. How effective is that for managing narcolepsy symptoms? And another interesting study in Italy looking at the application of meditation and relaxation. Was that going to be helpful? Or in the US, a study on mindfulness-based intervention as non-drug treatments. So there's a lot of opportunities to be involved in clinical research, basically to help progress not only the drug treatments, but other types of treatments and approaches, and also a scientific understanding of narcolepsy. So I think this is my last slide. The impact of patient engagement at all stages of that drug development process, as well as all those different types of clinical studies, is really key. And there's a great excerpt that I put on the top here from an FDA website that says, as experts in what it is like to live with their condition, patients are uniquely positioned to inform the understanding of the therapeutic context for drug development and evaluation. And FDA has put in place a number of different types of mechanisms by which they can get input from individuals living with certain disorders. And there's a great example of their Narcolepsy Voice of the Patient Day that was held in 2013. That report is on the web, and I've got it on my last slide as a link in case people are interested to see. They interviewed many, 100 some individuals living with narcolepsy about their symptoms, about their treatment, about what's needed. And that's, even though it's quite a while ago, it probably could be refreshed, does form a really nice basis. And more recently, then they have different initiatives here, a patient-focused drug development initiative where they can more regularly get feedback and input from patients. Of course, pharma companies who are developing drugs also seek input from people, say, with narcolepsy or other disorders on a regular basis. We need that input. We have to do at the beginning a lot of listening and learning to understand what it is like to live with that condition. What are the current medications? How well are they behaving? What is the unmet need out there that we should be focused on? Advice, we'll also seek advice, for instance, on how a drug might be administered, what might be useful or really not in a particular setting, to understand the journey from onset of symptoms to diagnosis, and these daily challenges of living with the condition that might actually help us to design clinical studies that are more accessible for individuals, but also to help design outcome measures that may be measured in a clinical study and have impact, showing that there may be benefits that can help towards approval and or reimbursement of a drug. So basically, the right-hand side is really just that summary that across the entire process, input from individuals living with narcolepsy and other individuals is really critical to make sure that we end up driving the most informed programs possible, and therefore come up with the very best possible drugs. And really a huge thank you, I think, to all of those who are involved in any way with clinical trials, even considering clinical trials, and those who also participate in some of these other engagement activities to help teach us who are trying to develop new drugs really what is needed and help us to progress our programs towards the best possible outcomes. So thank you very much to Wake Up Narcolepsy for this opportunity as well. And what I've done is put here just links to a couple of resources that I've talked about in my presentation today, in case you want to take a look for more information.